My daughter-in-law called me uneducated in front of her friends. So I handed her my law degree. And a rent bill? My son's wife and my son thought I was quiet. Unremarkable. The woman who folded the laundry, set the table, and knew when to leave the room without being asked. They never questioned who I was before I became someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's shadow. They liked that I was convenient, forgettable, especially my sister-in-law. She liked it best when I stayed in the kitchen, or in the background of her photos, blending into the corners like wallpaper from another era. The day she laughed at me in front of her friends, calling me uneducated as if it was a joke, I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I just smiled and walked away. But something inside shifted, something ancient and steady. I went to my room, opened an old box I hadn't touched in years, and pulled out the truth. Because sometimes, the loudest thing a woman can do is remind you of what she used to be before she let the world squeeze her into silence. I had lived in that house for almost 5 years. It was supposed to be temporary, a short stay after I sold my old home, just until I figured out what to do next. But life has a way of folding itself into corners, of settling into patterns you never meant to repeat. My son insisted at first. He said it made no sense for me to live alone when they had space, and maybe at that time it truly felt like a generous offer, like family. In the beginning, I helped with everything. I cooked breakfast before they woke up. I folded laundry quietly, and placed it in neat piles outside their bedroom. I picked up the groceries. I made myself invisible in the way only older women seem to learn with time. Present, useful, but never loud enough to disturb the rhythm of younger people's lives. But as the months slipped into years, that invisibility stopped being a choice. It became expected. I would sit at the kitchen table in the mornings reading an old paperback novel while they scrolled through phones and exchanged plans I was never part of. There was a time when my son used to ask for advice. Now, he barely looked up from his screen. And she, my daughter-in-law, well, she treated me like part of the furniture. Politely, distantly, occasionally, with a forced smile. The kind people use with strangers they don't really trust. She called me Mom sometimes. Only when guests were around. Otherwise it was just her. Not in a mean-spirited way, but cold. As if acknowledging my presence was an inconvenience. I told myself not to take it personally. After all, it was their home now too. They had careers to grow, dinners to host, friendships to nurture. I was just a placeholder from another time. A relic who didn't understand the language of their ambition or their jokes or the way they measured self-worth by LinkedIn titles and brunch reservations. I tried not to mind. I made sure dinner was always ready by the time they came home. I made pot roast, lasagna, slow-cooked stews that filled the whole house with warmth. Sometimes I heard her sigh before she even reached the kitchen, complaining under her breath about heavy food and how she was trying to cut carbs. I offered to make something else. She said it was fine. She always said it was fine, but her face told me otherwise. She rearranged things in the fridge after I organized them. She replaced my dish soap with eco-friendly brands that made my hands crack. She started labeling the spice jars, not because I forgot them, but because she didn't like the way I placed them. Little things really, but they added up like paper cuts. Small, silent dismissals that reminded me of where I stood. Even my space in the house felt conditional. My bedroom, once the guest room, had become my only refuge. I started spending more time there, reading, knitting, watching old court dramas on a tablet with headphones on so I wouldn't disturb the flow of the open-plan living room. My books remained on one shelf. My sweaters in one drawer. Everything else belonged to them. I didn't mind not being seen. I had known that feeling before. As a young woman in a male-dominated law firm where my opinions were valued only when a man repeated them. As a mother whose sacrifices were understood but never spoken of. Being unseen was nothing new, but in your own son's house, it pinches in a different place. She began hosting friends more often, brunches, wine nights, book clubs. I helped prepare quietly before retreating to my room. Sometimes, they didn't even knock. They used the good plates, the tablecloths I brought with me from my old house. Once I overheard her telling a guest she'd pick them up from a vintage store in Brooklyn. I said nothing. What would be the point? I stayed out of photos. I stayed out of conversations. I stayed out of their way. Still, I tried to show gratitude. I bought flowers for the dining table. I sewed new curtains for the kitchen when the old ones began to fade. I clipped coupons. I baked muffins for her co-workers. And I told myself over and over again that I was lucky to be around family, that it was better than being alone, that this distance between us was just modern life, not malice. But deep down, I felt it growing, That quiet ache of displacement, the slow erosion of identity until all that was left was a shadow in the corner of someone else's life. They never asked me what I had done before retirement, never wondered why I spoke carefully, why I observed so much. I wasn't a mystery to them. I was a non-story, a footnote. Sometimes, I looked at my reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back. I looked older in their mirrors, like someone who had overstayed her welcome. I kept telling myself to be grateful. I kept telling myself it was just temporary. I kept telling myself I still had a place here, until one day, I stopped believing it. The day of the party had arrived quietly, though I had known about it for over a week. She mentioned it offhandedly during one of her morning calls, telling someone it was just a casual girl's thing, nothing big, but I knew what that meant. Nothing in this house was ever truly casual, not the clothes she wore, not the food she served, not the way she spoke. It was all curated, designed, polished. Even her offhandedness was intentional. I had offered to help. I always did. She barely looked at me when she thanked me, but she didn't refuse. So I ironed the tablecloth, cleaned the silverware, polished the glasses, and arranged the appetizer platters. I stayed in the background as usual. My hands worked from memory. It wasn't the first time I prepared for guests I wouldn't speak to. Probably not the last, I had thought. She didn't ask me to leave. She didn't have to. I understood my role, helped set up then disappear. That's what I had been doing for years. The only difference now was how natural it had all become. By late afternoon the house was filled with the smell of roasted vegetables, spiced nuts and balsamic glazes. Every candle was lit. Every plate placed perfectly. Music played low and trendy in the background. The doorbell rang, and one by one, her friends arrived. Bright, perfumed, full of easy confidence. Women in their early 30s with manicured hands and bright laughs. They greeted her with hugs and compliments. She basked in it. The house looked stunning, they said. So stylish, so elegant. I heard them. I was still in the kitchen, arranging the last of the fruit. I had planned to go to my room once they had all arrived, but somehow, I lingered. I stayed by the edge of the dining room, sipping tea from my usual mug, quiet and small, half hidden behind the pantry doorframe. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see what they would say. Maybe a part of me wanted to feel included, if only by accident. They talked about everything: promotions, Pilates, the latest wellness retreats. She was the center of the circle, laughing, gesturing, pouring wine like a hostess in a lifestyle magazine. They all admired the floral centerpiece I had put together that morning. She took credit, of course, said she got the idea from a Pinterest board. One of them noticed me. Just a glance at first, a passing nod. Then another one turned and smiled, asked a question I barely heard. Something about who I was, or maybe where I was from. She answered for me, loud enough for the room to hear, but light enough to pass for humor. That was her style. She said I was just the sweet, quiet mother-in-law. Then she added something else, something about how I'd never really been into school, that I was more hands-on than academic. There was a pause, then laughter. Not cruel, but the kind that pricks you just the same. One of them asked if that meant I'd never gone to college. She laughed again. Said she wasn't sure, but probably not. Said that I always seemed more like a doer than a thinker. I didn't react. I didn't move. I stood there holding my tea, feeling the porcelain heat through my palm. I stared into the mug like it might offer me a way out, like I could shrink into it and disappear. There was no venom in her tone. That's what made it worse. She wasn't angry. She wasn't trying to humiliate me. It was just a reflex, a joke to fill the space. But it landed like a slap, not because it was cruel, but because it was casual, because it meant so little to her and so much to me. I had worked so hard to build a life. I had studied late at night while working full-time. I had passed the bar when I was already raising a toddler. I had argued cases in courtrooms where every man wanted me to fail. I had done all of that and more. And here I was, reduced to a punchline in my own home. No one asked me to speak for myself. No one turned to me for clarification. They just kept sipping their wine, leaning back into the cushions of their curated little moment, perfectly content with the version of me she had offered. I retreated to the kitchen slowly, careful not to let the door creak. I didn't want them to hear me leave. I didn't want them to remember I was still there. Back in my room, I sat on the bed with my mug still full. I didn't cry. I had done that enough in my life. Instead, I sat in silence, letting the noise of the party blur into the background. Their voices were muffled through the walls, rising and falling like waves. My breath was steady, my hands still. It wasn't just the insult. It was the erasure. The fact that she could say something so profoundly untrue, so diminishing, and no one would question it. Because to them, I was exactly what she described. Invisible, unimpressive. Just a sweet old woman who kept things tidy. She didn't know who I had been. None of them did. But I realized, in that moment, I had allowed it. I had let myself fade little by little until I had become the person they imagined. Harmless, simple, uneducated. I looked toward the closet. I hadn't opened the top shelf in years. Somewhere, buried beneath old blankets and dusty photo albums, was a box. I remembered the texture of it, the weight, the papers inside, my name in gold letters. I didn't get up right away, but something had shifted quietly, permanently. I sat there and listened to them laugh. And I knew without a doubt that the next time she spoke my name, she wouldn't say it with pity. She would say it with shame. The morning after the party was unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peace but aftermath. The kind that hums beneath the skin and makes the air feel heavier than usual. I moved through the kitchen as I always did, preparing coffee, wiping down the counters, straightening the chairs. Nothing about my routine changed, but everything inside me had. They hadn't said anything after the party, not a word. She hadn't come to thank me for setting the table or ask if I needed help cleaning up. My son hadn't mentioned anything either. Maybe he hadn't even noticed. Maybe to him, it was just another evening. But to me, something had been carved out of the air that night. Something that couldn't be filled again. I kept myself busy. I swept the floor twice even though it didn't need it. I reorganized the pantry. I folded the same dish towel 3 times. Anything to avoid stillness. Because stillness meant remembering. Remembering the way her voice had curled around the words uneducated like it was an accessory. Remembering the way the others had laughed, not at me exactly, but around me, as if I was just another empty space to decorate the conversation. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just moved. My room felt smaller that day, as if the walls had crept closer in the night. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closet door. I thought about the box again. It had been so long since I opened it, so long since I allowed myself to remember what was inside. Part of me had let go of that identity years ago. I had filed it away, along with the suits I no longer wore, the heels I no longer needed, and the woman I used to be. But she wasn't gone, just waiting, buried beneath layers of service and silence. I stood up slowly and opened the closet. The top shelf was high, so I pulled over a chair. My knees cracked when I stepped up. My hands trembled as I reached behind the folded blankets and unused holiday decorations, and then I touched it. The box. The one I'd carried with me through 4 apartments and 2 decades, the one I almost threw away once, after my husband died. But something told me not to. I brought it down gently, brushed the dust from its lid and placed it on the bed. For a moment, I just looked at it. There was something sacred about it, something that made me hesitate, but then I opened it. The scent of old paper rose into the air. Faint ink, dried glue, time. Inside, neatly organized, were fragments of a life few people in this house even knew existed. My law degree, letters from firms that once tried to poach me, newspaper, clippings with my name in small black print beneath courtroom victories, photos from the day I passed the bar, my smile wide and certain, my eyes sharper than they'd ever be again. I held the diploma in my hands. The edges had curled slightly over the years, but the lettering was still bold. My name in full, the university seal, the date, the proof that I had once stood in rooms where people listened, where my words held weight, where my mind mattered. I sat there with it for a long time, not reading, not remembering details, just feeling the weight of the paper and everything it represented. All the nights I had studied after putting my child to bed. All the times I had swallowed my fear and spoken anyway. All the years I spent proving I was more than what people expected of me, and now I was a ghost in a house that thought I had never lived. The silence wasn't just around me. It had become part of me. I had let it settle in my bones, soft and constant. I had allowed their comfort to replace my story. I had become so careful, so small, so agreeable, that they forgot I had ever been anything else. But I hadn't forgotten. Not anymore. I placed the diploma back into the box carefully, like something fragile. Then I added a copy of the deed to the house. The one they didn't know was still in my name. I added a folded spreadsheet where I had tracked every monthly expense printout of the rental agreement template I found online the night before. It wasn't revenge. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I only wanted to be seen again, not as a burden, not as a relic, but as a person with history and value. A person who had earned the right to be treated with something other than dismissal. I closed the box and slid it under my bed. Not because I was hiding it, but because I knew I wasn't ready to use it yet. But the moment would come. I felt it forming slowly, like a storm beyond the horizon. That day, I didn't speak much. I made dinner, served it, and cleaned up afterward. They didn't notice the difference, but I did. The silence had shifted. It was no longer theirs. It was mine. The day I decided to write the bill, the sky was gray and low, as if the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. There was no dramatic spark, no final insult, no scene of confrontation that pushed me over the edge. It was quiet, subtle. Just another day in a long line of days where I had stood still while the world around me moved like I wasn't there. But inside me, something had settled, not anger, not revenge. Just resolve. They left early that morning. Both dressed sharply. Briefcases in hand, voices trailing laughter about some office inside joke. She didn't say goodbye. He muttered something on his way out, but it didn't land. I stayed at the kitchen table after the door shut behind them, my hands resting on the grain of the wood, my tea untouched. I listened to the silence. It was deep, thick, almost tender. It gave me room to think, room to finally act. The house was mine. That was the truth, the simple fact. My name was on the deed. I had bought it outright after selling my previous home. No mortgage, no cosigners, no hidden clauses. I had invited them in, offered them a safe place to start their marriage, believing it would be temporary. Believing they would eventually find their own place, build their own home, and leave me to rediscover what my own life might look like in the aftermath of everything I had already given. But temporary became indefinite, and somewhere along the way, I became an afterthought in my own space. I pulled out my files from the small lockbox I kept in the hallway closet. Inside were neatly organized folders, property documents, insurance, medical records, old tax returns. I took out the deed and laid it on the kitchen table, smoothing the edges with the flat of my palm. My name looked strange to me now. Printed so boldly, like it belonged to someone I used to know. Then I opened a new file on my laptop, a blank document. The cursor blinked patiently waiting. I titled it simply Rental Agreement. I didn't know exactly what I was doing, but I knew what I wanted it to feel like. Not petty, not spiteful, just fair, logical, professional. The way I had handled contracts before I became someone's mother-in-law and live-in cook. I calculated everything I had contributed since they moved in. The electricity bills I had paid, the food I had stocked, the furniture I had replaced without ever mentioning the price tags. I didn't inflate the numbers. I wasn't trying to shame them. I only wanted them to see the value I provided. The weight I carried in silence. I divided the months, 8. That's how long it had been since they promised they'd start looking for their own place. I printed each month's name in bold, followed by a breakdown of living costs. Then I added a single line at the bottom, due upon receipt. I read over the document twice. It wasn't aggressive. It was clear, factual, respectful. But it told the truth they had chosen not to see. That living in someone's home came with responsibility. That comfort wasn't the same as entitlement. That generosity had limits even when it came from a mother. I placed a printed bill beside the deed. I thought about slipping it into their room, leaving it on the nightstand. But that felt sneaky, passive, and I was done being passive. Instead, I went back into my room, knelt beside the bed, and pulled out the box again. I opened the lid slowly, folded the rental document, and placed it atop the diploma. It felt right, the two papers resting together, proof of who I had been and proof of who I still was. That night, I made dinner like always. I served it quietly. They chatted about work, about a new restaurant opening downtown, about an upcoming wedding they had been invited to. She complimented the risotto, but added that it could use less salt next time. I nodded. I smiled. But I was somewhere else entirely. Later, when the dishes were done and they had disappeared into the living room to watch TV, I sat in my room with the lamp on low. I stared at the box. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel vindication, just calm. The kind that comes after weeks of sleepless nights, when something in your gut finally aligns. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I wasn't trying to start a war. I was simply returning the truth to its place. They had forgotten that I had built a life before them. Soon I would remind them quietly, precisely, like a closing argument. The day I decided to return the truth to her, the sun had come out in thin, watery streaks as if it wasn't sure it wanted to commit. The kitchen smelled of lemons and starch, cleaner I had used that morning while scrubbing down every surface until it gleamed, not because it needed to be done, but because I needed the silence that came with wiping something down until it surrendered to clarity. I needed the discipline of doing something simple and final. She had another gathering planned. I knew it before she said a word. I heard her on the phone the day before giggling, telling someone to bring that incredible Riesling, and to come hungry, because the old lady always cooks too much. She said it so casually, like I wasn't just in the next room, like I was a fixture with ears too old to understand tone. So I cooked. I did it with the same quiet care I always had. Roasted vegetables, 3 kinds of salad, a quiche that took me hours to perfect. I ironed the napkins, laid out the cutlery, arranged the chairs. I poured her candles into crystal holders and polished the wine glasses. I even trimmed flowers from the garden and placed them in a vase on the dining table. I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me. For the part of me that had always taken pride in setting a table with intention, in making a space feel whole. The house filled slowly. First came her 2 closest friends, the ones who always wore leather boots in the summer and smelled like designer perfume. Then came the newer ones, the kind who asked questions they didn't want answers to. They moved around the house with their laughter like wind through thin curtains. Light, restless, meaningless. I stayed in the background just like always. I stood by the hallway near the kitchen pretending to inspect the spice rack. I sipped my tea. I waited. They gathered in the living room, glasses of wine in hand, their legs tucked beneath them on the sofa, their voices rising in crescendos of gossip and curated outrage. I could hear her leading the conversation as always, her voice louder than it needed to be, her opinions shaped to impress. Then someone brought up education, a documentary maybe, a podcast. Something about higher learning and access. And just like that, the air shifted. I knew it before she even opened her mouth. I felt it in the pit of my stomach. She said something about how not everyone needed college, that some people just weren't cut out for it. She laughed as she said it. A soft, dismissive laugh. Like education was just another trend that didn't age well. Then, as if on cue, someone asked about me. Jokingly, of course, something about whether I had ever gone to school. And there it was. She said it again. Almost word for word. She's more of a homebody, not really academic, but she's great with laundry and soup. I heard the laughter. I tasted the air between it, and then I moved. I walked into the living room slowly holding the box in my arms. The room didn't quiet at first. They didn't notice me right away. I placed the box on the coffee table, between their expensive wine and their polished charcuterie board. Only then did she look up. I didn't speak. Not a single word. I didn't need to. I opened the box. First came the diploma, still sharp and clean beneath its protective plastic sleeve. I lifted it carefully as if presenting evidence. I placed it in front of her, then turned to the others. I let them see it. I let them read the seal, the signature, the institution that so many of them had only ever dreamed of attending. Then came the folder. I pulled out the document with the rent summary, printed neatly, line by line. I placed it beside the diploma. I let her look at it. I let her understand it. Closed the door with the same care I had opened the box. I sat down on the edge of the bed and waited, not for a response, but for the silence that would follow, the kind of silence that weighs heavier than sound, the kind that forces people to face themselves. I didn't hear their voices after that. Maybe they left early. Maybe they stayed in stunned confusion. I didn't check. I had said everything I needed to say without uttering a word, and for the first time in years, I felt heard. Not because they had finally seen who I was, but because I had stopped letting them forget. The air in the house shifted that evening. It wasn't a gust of wind or the scent of something burning. It was the weight of discomfort. Heavy, urgent, unfamiliar. I heard them talking in hushed voices from the hallway as I folded laundry in my room with the door slightly ajar. Her voice came in sharp fragments, her tone brittle and cracking in places where confidence used to live. She wasn't laughing now. I imagined the conversation, her trying to explain away the diploma like it didn't matter, like it didn't change anything. Her scrambling to twist it into a misunderstanding, something harmless, a silly oversight. But the silence that followed her outbursts told me he wasn't agreeing. He wasn't laughing with her. He wasn't defending her. I knew my son well. I knew how long it took him to process a betrayal, how he carried guilt like a stone in his pocket once it finally reached him. It didn't always show on the surface, but it wore him down from within. I knew that tonight the realization had finally begun to settle, that for years he had allowed the woman he loved to chip away at the one who raised him, and he had said nothing. I heard the clinking of glasses being put away with more force than necessary. A drawer slammed. Footsteps crossed the hardwood floor without direction, like pacing wolves trapped in too small a space. She was unraveling her perfectly curated world. The one she'd built on appearances and assumptions was starting to show cracks. And I wasn't the one who had done it. I had simply removed the veil. I kept folding shirts and towels with slow, deliberate movements. Each crease lined up with a thought, each fold a memory. I didn't need to hear the full argument to know its shape. It had been building for a long time, not just about me, about control, about respect, about the stories we tell ourselves to justify our behavior. At some point, the door to their room closed with a solid, definitive thud, not slammed, but pressed shut with force. After that, the house fell into a strange stillness, not the silence of peace but the stillness of restraint, a tension waiting to break. The next morning, she didn't come into the kitchen. He did. His eyes were tired, rimmed red at the corners. He moved slower than usual, more carefully, as if unsure of what to say, how to stand, how to even exist in the space between us. I poured coffee without speaking, and placed it on the table. He nodded in thanks, a quiet broken gesture. I saw him glance toward the counter where the box still sat. I hadn't moved it. I wanted it to remain in their sight like a mirror they couldn't avoid. He didn't ask about it. He didn't need to. Later that day, I noticed changes. Small, but telling. The music she usually played while cooking was off. The scented candles she liked to burn were untouched. The TV stayed silent for hours. The rhythm of the house had fractured. She moved through it like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, leaving the room when I entered, pretending to look busy with tasks that didn't exist. He started staying later at work, or maybe he was just staying away. When he came home, there was no more laughter in their bedroom. No clinking of wine glasses, no whispered conversations spilling through the walls. Only the occasional heavy sigh, the kind you exhale when you realize something is lost and you're not sure how to get it back. She tried to reclaim control once, left a stack of real estate brochures on the coffee table as if to suggest they were finally looking for their own place. But I knew it was a performance, a distraction, a way to regain narrative. I didn't touch the brochures. I didn't ask. I simply continued setting the table for 3, then 2, depending on who appeared. One evening, she brought me a plate of cookies, store-bought, still in the packaging. She placed them on the counter and mumbled something about them being a peace offering. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because I didn't recognize the gesture, not after all the time she had walked past me like I was a lamp, not after she had laughed with her friends about how little I must have known, how little I must have achieved. Panic doesn't always look like screaming. Sometimes it looks like cookies in a plastic container. Sometimes it looks like someone rearranging the pillows on the couch 4 times in an hour. Sometimes it's silence that drips too slowly, or footsteps that pause at your door before continuing. But I didn't open the door. I let her sit with the tension she had created. It wasn't about rent anymore. It wasn't even about the diploma. It was about the story she told herself, that I was less than her, that I didn't belong in her world, that I should stay quiet, invisible, useful. And now that story was broken, and she was standing in the middle of its wreckage, barefoot, trying not to bleed. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek revenge. I simply resumed my place, not beneath her, not around her, but beside the truth. And the truth was that the panic she felt wasn't mine to soothe. It was hers to answer for. In the days that followed, I began to move differently through the house, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself in years. The air between us no longer crackled with tension. It simply grew still, like the quiet that follows a storm when the damage has already been done. There were no more words exchanged unless absolutely necessary. No small talk, no fake smiles. We passed one another in hallways like strangers who once knew each other in a different lifetime. I stopped cooking for them. At first, it felt strange. I had prepared meals out of habit for so long that my hands would move on their own, chopping, stirring, seasoning, long before I asked myself why. But now, I made only what I needed: a bowl of soup, a piece of toast, a single cup of tea. I no longer placed 3 plates on the table, no longer asked what time they'd be home. I ate alone, and I ate in peace. My routines became mine again. I took long walks in the morning, letting the cold bite at my skin to remind me I was still very much alive. I visited the library, ran small errands without telling anyone where I was going. I stayed in cafes longer than I used to, watching people, reading news articles, scribbling thoughts on paper napkins. I reclaimed silence as a space to breathe, not something I had to endure. She tried once or twice to re-enter the rhythm of politeness. She asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no. She mentioned a new recipe she wanted to try. I nodded. But I didn't participate. I didn't offer warmth. I didn't offer forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness, I had learned, isn't something you owe anyone simply because time has passed. Sometimes the wound is not in the cut itself, but in the dismissal of it afterward, and that was what had hallowed me most. Not the insult, but the years she spent pretending I was nothing more than background noise. He remained quieter than usual. He came home later, spoke less, avoided the living room unless he thought I was elsewhere. I could see the guilt on his face like an old coat he didn't know how to take off. But I didn't confront him. I had no energy left for lectures or tears. Let him sit in his own silence now. I began sorting through old boxes in my closet, things I had ignored for years. Photo albums from when my son was little, journals from my early days practicing law, letters from colleagues, some of whom had passed, reminding me of who I was long before I was called just mom or just his wife. I spread them out across my bed in the evenings like sacred artifacts, proof of a life no one else in this house had cared to know. I called my lawyer. It wasn't dramatic. I simply scheduled an appointment, dressed in my best wool coat, and went. The office smelled of leather and old files. I sat across from a man younger than my son and handed him the folder I had prepared. It contained a copy of the deed, my new will, and a letter that made it clear I wanted the house to go elsewhere, not to them. Not to anyone who thought they were entitled to it by proximity. When I returned home, I placed the receipt from the lawyer's office on the kitchen counter. I didn't say a word about it. I didn't need to. She saw it. Her eyes flickered when she noticed the firm's name. She didn't ask. She wouldn't dare. I slept better at night after that. There was no more waiting for footsteps in the hallway. No more pretending to be asleep when voices rose in the living room. I no longer cared what they said, what they thought, how they whispered behind closed doors. I had done what I needed to do. The rest was not mine to carry. I started spending more time outside, not far, just the garden, the porch steps, the park at the end of the block. I sat with books, sipped coffee, watched the world move. I let the sun rest on my face and felt the seasons changing, not just outside but within. I didn't mourn the loss of closeness. What we had before wasn't closeness. It was proximity wearing a mask. Real closeness requires respect. And once respect has been stripped away, what's left is something cold and hollow. I didn't hate her. I didn't even dislike her anymore. I simply released her. Released them both from the illusion that we were a family held together by anything other than obligation. I had spent years stitching myself into their lives with invisible thread, thinking if I stayed useful enough, kind enough, quiet enough, I might be seen. But I was done sewing myself into a story that treated me like a footnote. Now I lived parallel to them, not with them. And in that distance, I found something I hadn't known I was still searching for, myself. The house was quiet the morning she left. No suitcase wheels echoed down the hallway, no slammed doors, no theatrical goodbyes, just an absence, a kind of hollowing out of sound. I stepped into the kitchen and instantly knew she was gone. Her perfume no longer lingered in the air. Her mug wasn't sitting half-rinsed in the sink, and the silence had shifted from tension to vacancy. I didn't ask questions. I didn't check the guest room, or peer out the window to see if a car was waiting. I poured my tea, sat at the kitchen table, and sipped slowly. There was no note, no explanation, no apology, but there was something in the atmosphere, a retreat, an unraveling, a quiet acknowledgement that her version of this story had ended. He stayed. He hovered in the background those first few days, unsure of how to speak to me, unsure if he even had the right. I could feel the weight of his guilt every time he entered a room. It clung to him like dust, impossible to hide. He tried to fill the silence with tasks. He washed dishes, cleaned out the garage, offered to drive me to the store. I said little, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to explain. The truth had already spoken louder than words ever could. For a while we lived like that, two people orbiting the same space with caution and quiet. And then one evening, he made dinner. He set the table, served the plates, and sat down across from me without saying a word. The food was slightly overcooked, the seasoning uneven, but it was his effort that tasted different. We ate in silence, a comfortable one, the kind that didn't require fixing. Later that night, he knocked on my door. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, going through old papers again, court transcripts, letters from former clients, yellowed with time but still sharp with memory. He didn't come in. He just stood there, waiting. I looked up. He held something in his hands, a photo, one I hadn't seen in years. It was from the day I passed the bar exam. I stood in front of the courthouse, arms raised, my smile wide and uncontained. He had been just a boy then, clinging to my coat, too young to understand what the moment meant, but proud of me all the same. I remembered the way he had shouted, "My mom's a lawyer," to anyone who would listen. He handed the photo to me without speaking, then turned and walked away. I stared at it long after he was gone. The next day I made a decision, not out of bitterness, but out of completion. I visited the lawyer again and amended the letter attached to my will. The house would still go to the organization I had chosen, but I added a clause. My son could stay in it until he no longer needed to, not as an heir but as a guest, a tenant of memory, not entitlement. It was a final kindness, one that didn't erase the past but honored the part of him that had tried however late to see me clearly. I began packing soon after. Not everything, just the essentials. I'd found a small apartment near the lake, a quiet place with soft light and wide windows where I could read, walk and breathe without explanation. The rent would be modest, the view generous, and the silence mine alone. I left behind most of the furniture, the plates, the decor. But I took the box, the one with the diploma, the letters, the rent receipts and the photo. My life in fragments, held together not by history but by choice. On the morning I left I walked through each room slowly, not to say goodbye but to make peace with the space I had filled for so long. I stood in the kitchen where I had once been invisible. I touched the edge of the dining table that had never truly been mine. I opened the window in the guest room and let the air move through one last time. I left no note, no announcement. I simply closed the door and walked away. Freedom didn't feel like fireworks or thunder. It felt like air, like the absence of waiting, like the return of something I'd once given up to survive. Now in this new place, I drink my tea on the balcony in the mornings, and write letters to no one. I read books I never finished, plant herbs I may forget to water, and listen to the wind with the patience of someone who has nothing to prove. Sometimes I think of them, not with anger, just a distant ache like touching a bruise that's almost healed. They thought they knew me, but they never asked. And now, they never will. Thanks for watching. Take care, good luck.
After listening to today's story, perhaps it has raised some new questions in your mind, or maybe it has brought back some old memories. Every day on Reddit, new experiences and moments create fresh stories, and they connect all of us. Everyone has their own unique journey in life, and we all try to understand the world in our own way. These kinds of moments remind us that we are all human, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, and always learning something new. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share it with your friends. Your thoughts and feedback are always valuable to us, as they motivate us to create even better content. Every story has its own unique angle, and our goal is to understand everyone's perspective and make our content diverse and relatable. Stories like these help us realize that life's journey is different for everyone, and by hearing other stories, we learn something new. You can also share your own stories with us. Your experiences are valuable to us as well, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave your feedback. We aim to create content that brightens your mind and gives you new ideas every time. If you've already seen this video before, your feedback is still important. With every piece of feedback, we can improve our content and bring a new perspective to our viewers. Today, what we saw was just a small part of the many stories shared on Reddit and across the world. It's a reminder of how we all try to understand life by sharing our experiences with each other. This video was only an example of how we try to connect with others through storytelling, learning about different sides of life. We hope to continue sharing such stories that help us all learn and grow together. Thank you for your time, and don't forget to keep an eye out for more stories coming soon. If you haven't already, please like and follow for more amazing content. Your support keeps us going, and we will strive to bring you more thought-provoking and heartwarming stories. Until next time, take care and stay curious. *.